In the winter of his 41st year, Daniel Voss owned 4 companies, 2 private jets, a house on a cliff that looked like it had been carved rather than built, and a name that appeared in financial magazines the way certain names appear in weather reports, reliably, almost meteorologically, as if he were less a man than a condition of the market. And then, on a Tuesday in March, he did not show up to a board meeting that $300 million depended on, and no one ever saw him again in the life he had built. This is not a story about a crime. No one took him. No one hurt him. This is a story about a man who, at the exact coordinates of everything he had worked for, simply stopped and walked in a different direction. And the strange, uncomfortable truth is that almost everyone who has ever wanted anything badly enough has at some point wondered if they would have the courage to do the same thing. Daniel Voss did not begin as an heir or a prodigy. He began as the second son of a hardware store owner in a town where the tallest building was a grain silo, in a house where money was discussed the way other families discussed illness, quietly and only when it could no longer be avoided. He was, by his own later account, an unremarkable student who became remarkable through a single mechanism, an almost frightening tolerance for risk that other people mistook for confidence, when in fact it was closer to indifference. He did not fear losing because he had never had enough to be afraid of losing. This is, if you study the biographies of self-made men closely enough, a more common origin than the myth of genius admits. He built his first company at 23, sold it at 26 for a number that made his father stop speaking to him for 6 weeks. Not out of anger, but out of something closer to disorientation, the way a man might go quiet if his son returned from a trip having grown 8 inches. He built a second company. He built a third. By 35, Daniel Voss was no longer a person who made decisions so much as a person decisions were made around. Meetings did not start until he arrived. Sentences did not finish until he agreed with them. He had, without quite noticing the transition, become weather. There is a particular kind of loneliness that only exists at altitude, and almost no one believes it is real until they have lived inside it. It is not the loneliness of having nothing. It is the loneliness of having enough that no one around you can any longer be trusted to want anything from you except what you have. Friends from before the money began to feel like appointments. Colleagues began to feel like mirrors, showing him only the version of himself that was useful to reflect back. His second marriage, which had begun with what he described, years later as genuine tenderness, had quietly calcified into a kind of joint venture. 2 people managing a shared asset portfolio that happened to include a house and eventually 2 children who called him dad on video calls from boarding schools he had chosen for their reputations rather than their proximity. He did not notice the exact day it became unbearable. That is the part people find hardest to accept when they hear this story, because they want there to have been a single dramatic catalyst, a diagnosis, a betrayal, a death. There was none. There was only an accumulation, the way a ceiling does not fall because of one crack, but because of every crack that came before it, none of which alone would have brought anything down. What there was, instead, was a Tuesday. He was in the back of a car being driven to a board meeting concerning the acquisition of a logistics company he had never visited and did not particularly care about, reviewing numbers on a tablet that represented, in aggregate, more money than the town he had grown up in would generate in a decade of honest labor. And he looked up from the tablet and watched a man on a street corner adjusting a bicycle chain in the rain, unhurried, entirely absorbed. And Daniel Voss felt something crack open in his chest that he would later struggle to describe as anything other than grief. Not for the man on the corner. For himself. For the version of himself that might have been that man. Unhurried, absorbed, ungoverned by the tyranny of being important. He told the driver to stop the car. He did not go to the meeting. He walked, in a suit that cost more than the bicycle the stranger was repairing, for 4 hours, through a part of the city he had not set foot in for 15 years. And by the time the sun went down, something in him had made a decision that his conscious mind would spend the next several weeks catching up to. 3 weeks later, He transferred controlling interest in his companies to a trust managed by executives who had spent a decade positioning themselves for exactly this outcome without ever admitting it, even to themselves. He liquidated what could be liquidated quietly. He met with his two children separately in person and told them the truth in whatever form a man can tell his children the truth about wanting to disappear from the life he built for them. His daughter, 17 and already sharper than he had been at 30, asked him a single question. "Are you leaving us or are you leaving it?" He told her honestly that he did not yet know if there was a difference, and that this not knowing was the most honest thing he had said to anyone in a decade. The financial press, when he stopped appearing, produced the coverage such disappearances produce. Speculation of scandal, rumors of illness, one particularly persistent theory involving a rival firm and a folder of documents that never existed. Board members gave interviews using the specific, careful language people use when they are protecting a narrative rather than reporting a fact. None of them knew where he was, and this, more than anything else, unsettled them, because men like Daniel Voss are not supposed to be unreachable. Unreachability is what money is supposed to prevent. What the coverage never found, because it was never looking in the right register, was that Daniel Voss had not vanished into hiding. He had vanished into ordinariness, which turned out to be a far more effective form of invisibility than any offshore account or false identity, because no one searching for a billionaire thinks to search for a man restocking shelves at a hardware store in a town 2 states from the one he grew up in, using a name that was legally his own middle name, living in a rented room above a laundromat, sleeping for the first time in 11 years. Without medication, he did not do this performatively. There was no manifesto, no essay explaining the choice, no interview granted years later to reclaim the narrative for himself, which is, in its own way, remarkable. Given how rarely people with the means to control a story resist the urge to control it, he simply worked. He learned, slowly and with the humility of a man unaccustomed to being bad at things, how to cut keys, how to mix paint to a customer's exact and often unreasonable specifications, how to have a conversation with another human being that was not, in some way, a negotiation. He wrote to his daughter once a month. Not calls, letters on paper, mailed from towns he changed every few months for reasons he could not fully articulate even to himself. Something between caution and restlessness. She wrote back. Her letters, over 2 years, moved from anger to confusion to something that eventually resembled understanding, though she was careful, even at 19, never to call it forgiveness, because she was not certain forgiveness was owed, only comprehension. The trust that managed his former companies performed, by every measure the market recognizes, extraordinarily well without him, which either confirms that he was never as essential as the mythology of founders insists such men must be, or confirms that the machine he built had become, by the end, more durable than the man who built it. Perhaps both readings are true. Perhaps the myth of the indispensable man is mostly a story indispensable men tell themselves to justify what the pursuit of indispensability costs everyone around them. 2. Years after the Tuesday he did not attend the board meeting, Daniel Voss was photographed entirely by accident by a tourist taking a picture of a hardware store's charming, old-fashioned signage in a small town whose name has since been omitted from every account of this story out of an apparent collective courtesy. He is in the background of the photograph, blurred, unremarkable, adjusting a display of gardening gloves. The tourist posted the photograph to a local interest page. Someone eventually recognized the jawline. The story broke quietly, then loudly. Then, because Daniel Voss gave no interviews, made no statements, and did not return to any of the 4 companies that still technically bore his imprint somewhere in their founding paperwork, it faded, the way stories fade when the subject refuses to feed them. He is, as far as anyone outside a very small circle knows, still there, still cutting keys, still writing letters once a month to a daughter who now, by some accounts, visits him twice a year, quietly, without press, without explanation offered to anyone who asks. The question this story leaves behind is not really about Daniel Voss. It is about the particular arithmetic each of us is running, usually without admitting it, between what we are building and what it is costing us to build it, and whether we would recognize the Tuesday, if it came, or whether we would simply review the numbers on the tablet and go into the meeting anyway, because that is what the numbers on the tablet and the years behind them have taught us to do.